Hi guys, how are you all today morning? Good morning. Today is 11th July 2023. My name is TSV Raghavan. TSV Raghavan, and I live in Chennai, Tamil Nadu, India. This is my spiritual vlog on YouTube. Haribol TRSV Nectar NECTAR Nectar. In this particular vlog, in all my previous videos, we have been discussing about the knowledge and information that we have gleaned through the study of spiritual books, scriptures, contemplation on the material universe, and meditation on the spiritual universe. This particular video in the vlog is no exception to that rule. In fact, it is a mere continuation of all that we have been doing in my previous videos. Please subscribe to this vlog and press the bell icon so that I may keep reminding you of all my other videos. So let us start with the topic of today and discuss it quite fairly for all of us to understand. Today's topic is ether, ETHER, ether. Before coming to this particular topic, let us have a quick recap to brush up our own knowledge about creation in general and spiritualism in particular. There is a spiritual fire called spiritual whole, which is also called the Supreme Personality of Godhead. This Supreme Personality of Godhead has two types of energies. One, the superior one, is called spiritual energy, and the second, which is slightly inferior but quite powerful, is called the material energy. The spiritual whole is a spiritual spark, fire, just like any other ordinary fire in the material world also. It is an example to make us understand the actual spiritual whole or spiritual fire. Just like sparks fly out of the fireplace, similarly, spiritual sparks fly out of the spiritual fire or spiritual whole. These spiritual sparks have somehow come to know about the superiority in their own energy in the eyes of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. In other words, this spiritual spark is as qualitatively superior as the spirit whole or the spirit spark or the spirit fire. There is one spirit whole from which spirit sparks fly out thinking that they are qualitatively as superior as the spirit whole or the spirit fire. Now, qualitatively, they may be correct. They are superior spiritual energies qualitatively. But when it comes to quantitative energy, these spirit sparks are nowhere near the spirit fire whole. In other words, they are only qualitatively superior and not quantitatively equal. On the other hand, the material universe or material energy may be inferior qualitatively, but quantitatively it is just like the whole spirit fire. That is, quantitatively it is huge and extremely powerful in size and energy. Though inferior, it is superior to the qualitatively superior spirit spark. But in its ignorance, this spirit spark thinks that it can lord it over the inferior material energy. In that process, once this spirit spark starts revolving or floating in the ether, slowly but steadily it comes in touch with the material universe. Once it gets near the material universe, it slowly but steadily gets attracted to the material universe. In other words, the spirit spark, which was floating around in the ether independently till now, gets attracted to this inferior energy of material universe. When it does so, it comes closer to the material world, thinking that because it is the superior spiritual energy, it can lord it over the material universe. When this happens, the same spirit spark becomes a spirit soul. That is, the identity of the hitherto spirit spark changes into a spirit whole. Now we shall take a detour in this matter. Just like a sea shellfish which keeps its own wide mouth open in the sea to attract food. Similarly, this material world tries to attract food into it. When some other uninvited or unwelcome object like piece of stone or drop of water accidentally drops into this wide open of the seashell gets very irritated by this intrusion. Similarly, when the spirit soul comes in touch with the material selfish or shellfish, it also gets irritated. When the shellfish gets irritated by this uninvited guest, and when it wants to stop this irritation caused by such intrusion, this shellfish begins to wrap this particular foreign object with its own saliva. Thus, layers and layers of saliva of the shellfish are used to wrap around that foreign object so that it may stop irritating the shellfish. Similarly, when the spirit soul comes in touch with the material world, the irritated material world begins wrapping around layers of material body around this particular uninvited spirit soul. The spirit soul and the foreign objects are similar. The spirit soul in the material universe is equal to the foreign object that had accidentally fallen into the open mouth of the shellfish. This foreign object in the mouth of the shellfish, when is wrapped around with the saliva of the same shellfish, this turns into a pearl. Similarly, when the spirit soul is wrapped around by the material world with its own material bodies in different layers, this spirit soul becomes a living entity. Pearl equals living entity. When the raw spirit spark became a raw spirit soul and then found itself wrapped around with material layers of material body, its endless cycle of birth and death in the material world begins. Thus starts the journey of this spirit soul in the torments and trials of the material world in, through different births and deaths. These births begin with cells. From the first birth as a cell, this living entity, after its death, becomes an amoeba, an algae, a weed, a plant, a tree, an insect, a worm, a reptile, an amphibian, a beast, or any other such living entity till it reaches the stage where it can start taking birth as a human being. There are lakhs and lakhs of species of living entities that take birth in this material world. They are all misinformed and distracted and ill-advised spirit sparks which tried to lord it over the material nature and in that process came near the material world, became souls, got wrapped up with layers of the material body and began their endless journeys through different births and deaths. This has happened to every living entity, whether human or not, whether male or female, in which this person has to go through the grind till one day the same spirit soul gets self realized through spiritualism and meditation and then tries to get liberated from such endless cycle of repeated births and deaths. This is known as the ultimate liberation. When this raw spirit soul attains liberation finally, it becomes a very clean, humble, noble, and God loving and fearing soul. This individual soul then tries to get delivered to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and this is known as deliverance. So, this is the actual cycle that every living entity goes through to attain the ultimate aim of going back to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. But today we are going to talk about another subject altogether. As I had mentioned before, this material universe, when it gets irritated by the intrusion of the foreign object called spirit soul, begins enveloping this spirit soul in such a way that this spirit soul helplessly gets entangled in the cycle of repeated births and deaths. These layers of material body are broadly four in number. These four are: the first layer, which is quite subtle, is known as causal intelligence. This layer of causal intelligence is closest to the spirit soul materialistically. After causal intelligence comes the second layer known as astral mind of feelings and emotions. This is closer to the layer of causal intelligence but not as close to the spiritual soul. The third layer is known as etheric senses. This etheric senses is closer to the astral mind layer, but it is not as close to the layer of causal intelligence and the spirit soul itself. However, there is a fourth layer also. It is known as the gross body. This gross body is a layer which is the final layer of material body wrapped around every spirit soul. This gross body is closest to the subtle body of etheric senses but not as close to the layer of astral mind, causal intelligence, and spirit soul. Now let us have a recap. There is one spirit soul which has advertently or inadvertently come in touch with this material world. When it does so, the irritated material world begins wrapping it with its own saliva of material body. The first layer of that saliva is known as causal intelligence. The second layer is called astral mind of feelings and emotions. The third layer is known as etheric senses, which are five in number, and the fourth is called the gross body, which wraps around the etheric senses subtle body, the astral mind subtle body, the causal intelligence subtle body, plus the spirit soul as such. We already know that one living entity is identified in this material world by its gross body alone. Thus, the shape of a tree, a plant, a shrub, a weed, an insect, a worm, an amphibian, a reptile, a human being, etc., is based on its own identification in this material world through its gross body. We have already discussed in detail about this fourth layer called gross body. From now on, we shall start discussing in detail about the three subtle bodies that wrap around a spirit soul. Now, coming to the point, this material world wraps three subtle layers of material body around the spirit soul. There are actually 5 elements which are used by this material world to wrap 4 layers of material body around the spirit soul. These 5 elements are known as ether, air, fire, water, and earth. Ether is something which can neither be seen nor felt. The second element, air, comes from this first element, which is called ether and which is very subtle. This air can be felt but not seen. The third element, fire, comes out of this air. This fire outside in the material world can be seen, but it cannot be seen inside the material body of a spirit soul. However, it can also be felt just like the air in the material body. The fourth layer, called water, emanates out of fire. But this water in different forms like blood, mucus, urine, sperm, etc., can not only be felt but also seen by the naked eye of any living entity. The fifth element or the final element, earth, emanates out of water and it can also be seen plus felt by the naked eye of any living entity. The last 4 elements, that is, air, fire, water, and earth, are used to make up this gross body which helps identify that particular living entity in the society. However, the first 3 layers of material body, namely etheric senses, astral mind, and causal intelligence are made up of the first element alone, which is known as ether. This is one introductory part which I wanted to discuss with you all before proceeding further and discussing about this first element called ether. This is all knowledge or crystallized knowledge to understand the material and spiritual life of a soul better. Our ultimate aim is to go back to the Godhead. I said our because I personally identify myself with the spirit soul that I am, and I am going through several material births and deaths in this material world. I do not want to identify myself with these infinite and unending births and deaths in the material world. And I hope that students of spiritualism think likewise and would like to identify themselves with the original spiritual soul. The ultimate aim of the spirit soul is to get liberated from the repeated births and deaths and then ultimately get delivered to the Supreme Personality as a fully evolved soul. Our ultimate aim is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. This is the gist of whatever I said today. Kindly let me know what you think of my talk on this particular matter. Please give me your own expert opinions, thoughts, and ideas so that I may blend everything together for the sake of this society. Before concluding, let me remind you that I am also a published author with Amazon Kindle and paperback. I write on spiritualism, fiction, and assorted subjects. Spiritualism happens to be my favorite subject. Till we meet in my next video, it is good morning from TSV Raghavan.